Today we're going to talk about painting with shapes, and we're going to be using the work of John Singer Sargent, diving into some of his watercolors to really get a good sense of what can we learn about painting with shapes from the masters and how can we apply it to our work. We're going to look through a bunch of paintings, work through a demo, and by the end have a much better idea about how we can use shapes to make our paintings more powerful. So one of my students from my gouache painting class just asked about how they can get something abstract like grass and not be painting every single detail, but rather lean into the shapes, the big shapes, the medium shapes, and the small shapes, and make them feel integrated so that they're all working together to communicate, but not really relying on sort of individual pieces of grass or having it feel like the whole thing is falling apart all the time. And there's absolutely a way. So we're going to dive into some of these John Singer Sargent paintings and see what we can find. All of these are done in watercolor. They're all done on the spot, on location. So there's some degree of time constraint about how these are done. And I actually find that when I'm working from life, I become a much wiser painter. For this very reason, when I'm sitting here painting from life, I have to make big choices and I have to reserve my detail and my focus and my information for the things that really matter and not put them onto the things that don't. When we're working through this and we have a short period of time, we have to start relying on the bigger shapes in order to try and convey what it is that we're looking at. So here's this beautiful painting. We also have this unfinished painting that tells us a lot about how John Singer Sargent was working at the time. We have this painting here of giant field of hay, and this last one here with a lot of architectural information. There's a sense that John was really trying to be true to what he's seeing in front of him, while still relying on the major shapes to do most of the communicating. The interesting part is that we can really see what it is that he's communicating. He didn't have to go into details for us to get the feeling and the understanding of what it is that we're looking at. So the first thing I want to talk about is really, what is the power of a big shape? And one of my favorite examples is from the cartoon Pokemon. Now, if you grew up in the 90s, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You would go through the TV show and just before an ad break, it would come out and say, "Who's that Pokemon?" And it would give you something like this. It would give you the silhouette of a single Pokemon. And it gives you all ad break to try and figure out who it's talking about. But you don't need all ad break. You see, there's a part of the visual cortex in our brain that is solely dedicated to edge detection. And somehow this gives us the ability to really understand what we're seeing just by looking at the edges of a shape. So within a second, you can see that this here is Pikachu. We have a Bulbasaur and a Squirtle. And the absolute amazing thing is it requires zero attention to what is actually going on inside of the shape. And so our brains are designed to take this abstract information, the silhouette of what it is that we're seeing, and give us what we need in order to communicate clearly. So for us as artists, this becomes a crucial piece of information. And doubly so, if you're out in the field and you're painting something on location, you don't have time to focus on things that don't matter. This is a piece of information that matters because within a split second, somebody can know what it is they're looking at, and you did zero rendering, zero brushwork, zero fancy things with anything. You just created the large shape. So this is the power of the large shape. However, most of the time, my students can get a hang of that and can get a hold of that. That's not hard to understand because we've seen it and the examples of this are really, really clear. The hard part becomes then, how do I add other shapes into what it is that I'm seeing? And so for most people who are at the beginning stages of their journey, what it is that we see is that they have the big shape down decently, and then they come in and start to put in the little minute details in a way that has nothing to do with the big shape. And in doing so, they find themselves in a position where they're adding information and it's just pulling everything apart. The whole painting starts to fall to pieces and they don't know why and they don't know what to do about it. And so we come to the idea that you've probably heard before of big shapes, medium shapes, and little shapes. Really dividing everything you do up into big, medium, and little shapes. And it's quite common to skip out on one of these. You can either do small shapes and medium shapes. You can do medium shapes and big shapes. You can do small shapes and big shapes. And if they're not communicating with each other, you're gonna find yourself in a lot of trouble. And so while this doesn't say anything about the technique that you use, how you get there, this says a lot about how we process information. So let's go into a really good practice for trying to get the important pieces of information from the big shape down to the medium shape, down into the small shape. How do we prioritize information that actually matters? One of the first things I want to look at inside of this painting is we have our big shape. This is what's going on. This is our silhouette around our outside. And if I were just to be looking at the silhouette, I'd have a decent idea about what's happening. So here we are. Our eyes are really good at picking out things that involve a human. So without any other piece of information, I can kind of see a face up here. I can definitely see an arm down here. And this foot makes things really, really clear. And while automatically I might not know what this is just from its surroundings, given the context of the head, the arm, and the foot, I can tell we're probably dealing with a figure here. And I have a good idea about what this figure is doing. So this is our our big shape, our largest piece of information that's already giving us a lot of the context clues for what's happening in the painting. But it's what happens next that really helps us figure out what's important. When we take this figure and we start to break it up into medium shapes, these are the shapes within shapes that help us to see, perhaps in this case, light and shadow. We see that these shapes aren't just arbitrarily put in. We can find that the medium shapes are talking to that big shape. And here's what I'm talking about. This large shape here is broken up into this medium shape right here. We can see that put in, and it's all described by this shadow that comes down here. But the shadow is heavily connected to the silhouette of the big shape. This big shape comes in, comes down here, and then the contour moves and changes. And it's this point of movement right here where this shape comes in. So we take these small movements in the big contour right here and right here, and they are the start, the beginning, and the end of the medium shape. As this shape comes in, we can see it's happening at the change of form, as the silhouette, the contour of the body also happens. Now, I'm gonna say that, and that's gonna be like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. You know, why is this worth mentioning? But it's worth mentioning because if you're not looking for this particular pattern to happen, and we are only taking it from life, but if we're not looking for this particular pattern to happen, then we're gonna miss it. I see people all the time missing it. They'll place the shadow in, and the shadow might be placed right here, where it has nothing to do with the contour of the outside. Or they'll make the drawing so that the drawing itself is straight, and for no reason, the shadow happens in the middle of a straight line. Now, of course, lighting is infinite, everything is variable. There are gonna be times and situations where this isn't what happens. But again, we're not just making things up, we're working from observation and taking note that a change in form, a change in contour can quite often be attached to a relationship between our big shapes and our medium shapes. We have a movement in the contour of the big shape, and it's 100% connected to what happens with this medium shape. We have a movement in the contour of the big shape here that's connected to what's happening in the medium shape right here. Our big shape moves, and so does our medium shape. And so as we're sitting here, looking for a way to make our shapes actually work together and communicate well, looking for the places where our medium shapes are communicating with our big shape, takes a little piece of information and makes it go a mile. And so we can even see in the grass in the background here, we have our really big shape as it moves in here. And there's so many things that you could do within this grass. Why put any particular shape in any particular place? Why decide to emphasize one thing over the other? And it's the shadows that we're seeing that come in here, and they wrap around implicitly into the big shape. Again, this means that our small shapes, our medium shapes, and our big shapes are literally working together to communicate one thing. And so as you look at this unfinished piece by John Singer Sargent, we can come in here and really have a look. My brain already knows what's happening even though there's zero detail in here. I don't need eyes or a mouth or a nose to see that this is a face, because the big shapes are telling me that already. I even have a little ear coming in here, and that's enough for me to know what's happening. I can see the rooftop of this house up here and the contour of it really very, very clearly. And that means that there's almost permission to go a little bit more crazy in terms of the colors and the textures that are happening inside of that shape, because the shape is clear enough that it holds what's happening. And so the higher clarity we can find inside of our big shapes, the more we can lean into the texture and fun and creativity of everything else in the painting. So this question from my student in the gouache course was really about grass, something that is wild and it's made up of details. And so we're going to dive into maybe a little demonstration about how this might work. And by the way, if you're interested in learning to paint with gouache, I have an 8-week online class that I'd absolutely love to see you at, where we lean into learning gouache from the beginning and finding its edges and getting all of the students to a point where you can feel fluent and confident in what you're doing, so that you can go out and paint and just go anywhere you want, travel around, bring this really special medium with you and learn how to live the creative life. I also have a free online workshop about how I would learn to paint with gouache if I was to start all over again. So links to both of those are down below. So let's look at this. The first thing, again, we want to look at this big shape. We're going to really coming in here and trying to get a good idea about how to paint something like this when it's so chaotic. And so the step number one is to distill it down into its biggest shape. What kind of space does this thing take up? One of the things that I find most people tend to disregard when we're painting something like a bush or a rock, something natural, something that's hitting the ground plane and is a little bit hard to sort of get your head around, is we want to really ground it into the earth. This means really focusing in on what happens here as whatever it is we're painting really touches the ground. If we haven't trained ourselves yet, we tend to think about the objects that we're painting as something that happens up here, as if I could just cut the bottom off of grass or off of a rock and really focus on what happens up here. And I'm all for focusing on what happens at the top, so long as we then also focus on what happens at the bottom. Because this piece of information down the bottom actually tells us more than what happens at the top for a couple of reasons. One is it actually gives us a better idea about what's happening in three-dimensional space. Every piece of movement downwards, so we have this here and this here, all of these movements are movements in three-dimensional space. This is the shrub coming towards us and moving away from us. So every piece of information we put as it hits the ground gives us three-dimensional space and tells us the angle we're looking at, whatever it is we're looking at from. Now, people don't have to sort of consciously do that as the viewer, but when you first begin, you have to consciously do that as the artist. And so if you find yourself painting shrubs and grass and it looks and feels flat, it's because generally we haven't thought about all of this at the bottom and how our grass actually interacts with the rest of the ground. Secondly, it gives us the information about not just the shrub itself, but what it's sitting on. So I could be here, and as I'm moving my shape around and really sort of finessing it like this, I'm talking about the grass as much as I'm talking about the shrub. So this becomes really, really important. But our real main question here is, how do I then start to put in these medium shapes and the small shapes so that I can do it in a way where everything is communicating together? And our first answer is obviously to look at our reference. It's going to tell us everything that we need. However, because we are pattern-making machines, our brains are, we can make strange patterns out of things that actually exist if we don't know what we're looking for and we haven't delved into really what makes a shape powerful and how can I help that? Again, not by making things up, just by leaning into what is there. And so we see this as one object, but now we want to break it up into some smaller objects. So for example, given the context clues of this down the bottom, plus I can start to see some lighter spaces at the top, I can really start to see this as its own shape. This is going to be one of these medium shapes. I can see this over here as a medium shape. Looking at the ground, I can see this is taking up its own space. And so it also is its own medium shape. We can also look at the top for these clues. We have this at the top here, as well as at the bottom. So this is its own medium shape 100% for sure. We also have this connection of what's happening in the ground here and what's happening at the top here. They both intersect in this space when we have this medium shape here. And then we also just have the values that we're looking at. We have the shadows in here that we can see. So we might come back in here and place in our medium shapes. So you can see we haven't like gone crazy. We haven't really taken everything. As we're looking at these shapes and making discernments about what's there, we've just split it up into two. Again, we're not talking about style. We're just talking about understanding our big and our medium shapes and doing something to have them feel cohesive and work together. And so these big shapes and the medium shapes are working together. And the end result of that is that this suddenly starts to feel very three-dimensional. We can feel the turn of it. We can feel the roll of it. You can put your hands out and really feel it in real life without saying anything in terms of small detail or texture here or here. So this is really cool. If we just split it up into this big and medium shapes that communicate with each other, we're saying so much. We can also then go further in. Now I have an exercise here in a minute that I'm going to give to you guys, but this right here is where we can start to try and get a better feel for how a painting works. We want to look at this. We can feel its three-dimensionality. We can feel what it looks like. And as we add more information, we start to want to get a good sense about, is what I'm doing building the three-dimensionality and building the form that I'm seeing, or is it taking away? And at some point we start taking away the solidarity and the feeling of what we're looking at. And that's a really good moment to pause and stop and reevaluate. So I've just got this second level of information in here, really putting in a lot of this, right? It's not connected to the ground, so we didn't do it at first, but we can sort of see it in here. And you might go and say, well, Justin, I don't see it that clearly. And when it comes to painting shapes, we want to actually create things really clearly, almost overcommit to the shape first, and then pull back. Because one of the things that most of my students struggle with significantly when we're working through the gouache course or perhaps even the landscape course is undercommitting on our shapes, and suddenly our shapes become meaningless. You can see how we made this shape very meaningful from the beginning, and then added meaning, and then continued to add meaning. And every step of the way, we're communicating more and more. But if we don't commit to what the shape is, we end up losing all of this feeling that we've gained. And so we'd rather overcommit to what the shape is and then step back than to never quite commit in the first place. And obviously we can keep going and keep adding information. And we just want a sense of what is this that we're looking at actually doing in the painting. So for example, if this was a painting, this shrub is just center of the painting. It is focal point 101. And so we want to move it and add it and get the feeling we want and add all of the detail that it calls for and none of the detail it doesn't call for. If the shrub that I'm painting right now was actually in the back, then perhaps I don't want to add all this detail because it's not really the function of it within the painting. It wouldn't feel good to add that detail. And so we can just rely on our main shape and our secondary shapes, these medium shapes, or we can start to add in some extra shape, but a little bit more subtly. And so hopefully it becomes very clear that there's just no right and wrong way to do this. We're feeling out for what is the function that we're doing. Can we get our big shapes to communicate with our medium shapes, the medium shapes to communicate with our small shapes? And if we can do that, it's kind of like, and if we can do that, we are winning the game. And before we move into the exercise for the day, we really have this piece here that I think is exemplifying this as a whole. You can see when it was first painted, the focus is really just these really big shapes right here. One really big shape to communicate a whole field. This big shape then is split up with some of these medium shapes here. These medium shapes happen in conjunction with the detail in the big shape. We're talking about how grounding our shape, when it touches the ground and it's touching the focal point, that's when we want to pay extra close attention. And we can see this right here. It's moving in and out to give it a sense of groundedness, that it actually takes up 3D space, that it's not just a shape, that it exists three-dimensionally as well. And connected with that are these little dark spots, these medium shapes in here that say, yeah, the hay goes in here. And so now there's a shadow in there. The hay goes in here as well. Now there's a shadow in there. The big shape is connected to the medium shapes. And there's some places in here where there's a much more subtle medium shapes, but they exist. So they're placed in here and they give us, again, more depth, and they communicate what is being seen. Depending on what's interesting to the artist, John Singer Sargent here, he'll either leave things almost completely plain because they just don't matter quite so much, or find these areas that have far more shape language involved to give the big shapes and the medium shapes. And then the small shapes are sitting here side by side and connected with the big shapes and the medium shapes. I think one interesting thing to note is that our minds make up a lot of connections by themselves. We don't actually have to say, here's our big shape and here's our medium shape, and the medium shape literally goes into the small shape. We can say, here's our big shape and here's the medium shape that's connected to it. And it's like throwing a football to somebody on your team. The medium shape throws out this way and the small shape catches up here. We can have these moments and these gaps and these interesting things. It doesn't have to be literally connected at all times. We see that through all of these paintings, our big shape moving this way and our small shape catching that movement. It's connecting over here. We can have our big shape coming in and then our small shape picking up. And this is how we build shapes. We build information, we build detail, so that we get what's happening in the silhouette, that our brain just has this magical power of understanding. And what is happening in the silhouette is being picked up by the medium shapes. And sometimes it's a football being thrown to the small shapes, where we have a shape that has been thrown on one side and caught on the other side. If we're painting in real life, in person, on a time frame, this is how we build up really convincing form and information without highly rendering things. And then I think the last piece is that sometimes we're gonna do a big shape and a medium shape, and sometimes that's gonna feel like that is just enough. That's really doing the work for us. And when we've put in our big shape and our medium shape, and it's just not saying enough about the texture of what's happening or the nature of what's happening, that's when we wanna start to get in our small shapes to either create a lot of folds, or to come in and get little pieces of grass to tell us, yes, this is actually definitely grass, and this is what kind of grass it is, or what kind of tree it is, to get that information. And that whatever level of big, medium, small you want, it's all about what you want and how you want to communicate it. And whether you have a lot of detail in your painting or next to no detail in your painting, making sure that our big, our medium, and our small shapes are working together is what is going to allow us to put in whatever arrangement of information we want and have it work together. And so here's an exercise that we can use to actually get a lot better at this skill, which is come in here, find a painting, find something that you want to paint, and you place in all of the big shapes and really get them in there. Really just focus on getting what is roughly the right value and the right color in the right place, and see how much you can communicate with just the biggest shapes you possibly can. At some point, you're gonna hit a limit. And for example, you might come in here and you've placed all of this big shape in here, but that doesn't give you any of this. And so you say, okay, I actually think to communicate this balustrade, we need to place in these medium shapes. And so you put in the medium shapes, which is kind of all of these in here. These are shapes and they all coincide and cooperate with what's happening with the big shape. And then you say, that's great, but it doesn't give me the sense of form. I can't feel that three-dimensionality of what's going on. And so inside of this, all of these that are happening, placing in the small shapes that come in here, and again, they coincide, they work together with the medium shapes in order to get this through. And then you see how little you can do to get away with something that still feels really good. So you can see down here, there's so much information that was there in real life. It's even drawn in pencil that just doesn't make it to the final painting. And it's always worth mentioning that there is no right and wrong in any of this. There's no right or wrong way to do it. And so whatever style you want to lean into, 100% just go for it. But the real idea is finding an edge, finding where is the place where this painting starts to work. And that's the place where you've done the powerful things. Anything beyond that point might add. And so then you keep adding and adding until you find that you've found the place where things stop really adding to the painting in terms of how it feels and how it looks and how you receive it. And so we want to find that starting point. What is the lowest acceptable denominator for placing in shapes and values and colors and having it work as a painting without getting into any detail whatsoever at all? And then you work, and you're probably feeling it starting to become a little bit less important as it goes. And then at some point it drops off. These are the 2 points. When does it actually work? And when does what you're doing stop having really an appreciable effect to the painting? And if you can do those things, you really get a good sense of how a painting starts to work functionally. And then you get to choose. What do you want? What do you want your painting to look like and feel like? And now you have the tools to really get it there. This also means that when you go outside plein air painting, you can just do what's important to get the painting done, and then lean into the things that are exciting and really sort of keep you going. But that tells you so much about the art of painting in and of itself.